In the back class, the young adults just wrapped up a study that was based on a book titled Encountering Jesus. And this morning, as we prepare our minds and as we prepare ourselves to partake in the Lord's Supper, I'd like to share some thoughts based on a couple of the conversations we had in the class, and just something, I've been thinking about myself personally, and as well ties into the first song that Steve picked out for us to learn in our new song class on Sunday, the King of Kings, and that's a title that I think I'd put on this talk. But one of the encounters we studied in the class was recorded in Mark 14. If you want to turn over there, we'll start there in just a second. But in the class, really for me, one of the main big takeaways that I took was that it got me thinking about biblical narrative. And when I use that word, that's not to just put the word of, oh, the Bible is a story, but there is an aspect to the Bible that it's intentionally written, and that there are different motifs and different things that occur within the Bible that are meant to be hyperlinks, to use some more modern term language, that should stick out to us and make us think back to the things we've read. And for me, this account that we're going to read here is one of those times. But starting in verse 3, we read that, "And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at a table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head." If we were making this a TV show, this would be the moment where the record scratches and the screen freezes, and then all of a sudden you hear the narrator, the voiceover, come in and say, and you're probably wondering how I got here. It's that kind of moment that the readers who would have been originally reading this account by Mark would have had this moment of, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so we start taking a step back and trying to understand some of the things like the setting, the background to this scene that we have here, that Jesus being in Bethany. The setting of Bethany by itself is an interesting one, that it would spark different thoughts for the readers, that if you start looking at, and I'll say this, I'm by no means an expert of Hebrew. From the little that I've studied, there is a very interesting duality, or plurality, might be the better way to put it, with the word Bethany. But Bethany as itself, when you look at some of the roots in Hebrew, depending on how exactly it's interpreted, Bethany is translated as the house of misery or suffering, poor, afflicted, oppressed. That would be this place. So we're already thinking the setting that Jesus here is in the place of suffering, the place of misery. Not only that, but you take it a step further, and he's here at the house of a leper. When we read the Old Testament, we see so often that lepers are the outcasts, the forgotten, those who are removed from the community, that there are many laws that we see when we read the Old Testament that separated them because of the physical disease that they had. But yet, here we are, Jesus is here having what we would assume would be a meal, that they're maybe after a meal, that they're reclining at the table. And then on top of that, a woman comes to him. And not only does she come to him, but she brings expensive oil, and that she anoints him. And this is where, for me, that hyperlink, Kings, again, we've been learning the song King of Kings, that when we start connecting that idea of what it is as a king, Jesus is our king. I really appreciate Daniel, that I know he uses that language so often, King Jesus. But you go way back to the beginning, and we start back in Genesis, and we see God creates everything. He creates the earth, he creates the heavens, he creates everything that was within it. He creates humans, and he places humans within this special place, Eden. And there he is with them. His presence is there with them. But yet, sin, because of Adam and Eve, enters into the world, and that creates the separation, that the king is now separated from his people, and that there's a divide. And as well, the people, the members of that kingdom now get removed from that place, Eden. And we continue on going in the Old Testament. In Genesis 10, we see one of the first times where an actual king is mentioned, and his name is Nimrod. Nimrod has such a connotation now that if you're trying to insult someone, you might call them a Nimrod. But if you look at that word and what that name means, it means we will rebel. And not only that, his first city within his kingdom is Babel. And we start reading about Babel and what happens there with the Tower of Babel, and the rebellion, this idea of rebelling against God. We start to fast forward, and we see this new character, Abram, and his wife Sarah, and they deal with a Pharaoh, and they're so afraid of this Pharaoh that Abram comes up with this major lie where he tells the people that, or he tells the Egyptians that, hey, this isn't my this is my sister, this isn't my wife, out of fear of being killed by them. So again, we start painting this picture. Kings are not a good thing. We start fast forwarding. Again, we continue from there. Genesis 14, we see a lot of kings get named and mentioned, and they're all at war, and they're all fighting over these things. But for the first time, we also see a glimpse of a king here mentioned by name, King Melchizedek, who is different from these other kings, that he blesses Abram, but as well, not only that, he's a priestly king, which again, that's one of those things that will carry on with us as we continue in the narrative of the Bible. But then from here, we move forward and we look in Exodus, and what role does the Pharaoh play within the Exodus story? That the Pharaoh is the antagonist. The problem is what preventing Israel from being able to do what they are going to do. And then we accelerate from there. We start moving in Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy, in the laying out of the law, God actually institutes laws for the people of Israel, saying that there will come a time when they want to have a king, and that it talks about how they want to have a king because it's all the nations around me, that there's this idea that the king is something that makes them similar to the world around them rather than making them unique. They want this king as well. And then the different aspects of the law that's given there, that the concerns for this king that would be appointed is that they would be a foreigner, it'd be someone who wasn't a part of Israel, as well as it lays out warnings against acquiring many horses, acquiring excessive gold. And we see again this negative portrayal of what the kings will become for Israel, and that's even echoed as we get into Samuel and we start looking at the actual kings, and you just keep accelerating through this. And at the end of the day, the king is just not put to a good light so far, that as man is king, there is failures because men are flawed. But as we move forward, we move to even to Judges. You look at Judges, and that there's no king yet in Israel, but we see that there is just chaos and there's fighting and capturing. And Judges begins with the story of Judah and Simeon fighting and capturing a king who said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid to me. That his punishment for what he had done to other kings was to have the same thing done to him. And again, we just see this just sadness and this overwhelming sense of negative when it comes to these kings. But yet we start moving into some of the history of Israel, and we start looking, okay, we have Israel's first king appointed, that's Saul. But yet again, while it seems like it starts off great and that Saul was a good man, what is his undoing? Was that his attempt to assume the role of priest as well as king. Then we move on to David, and here we see another glimpse of what could be good, that a man known for being a man after God's own heart, but yet he had his flaws, that he was the same man who committed sin with Bathsheba, and you look at the story of what all he did to go in and to be able to have Bathsheba as his own. But again, we have a little bit of light coming in here, in that we see this promise made to David, that there will be someone who will sit on the throne forever, and that his throne shall be established forever. So we have one of those other hyperlinks that's going to continue on. But from David, we move into his son Solomon, and we see this pattern begin to establish, where you have maybe a little bit of good for a while and then bad. And then you read First and Second Kings and Chronicles, and again, just not many, if any of them, were what we would say would be a good king, not worthy of praise, not worthy of anything. And then we fast forward through that, and we start moving into the prophecy that all of a sudden, for the first time, like if you want to read in Isaiah 9 with me, that we have something again different, something shown that there's going to be a better future. As well, I'd like to take a step back and also point out something in Samuel that ties to the passage we're going to read in Isaiah. But in Samuel, David is recorded as saying this, that the Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like the rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. So while up to this point we've seen nothing but sorrow and trouble from these different kings, we see again that there is this better way, this better path for a king to be. And then we get to Isaiah and we start having prophecies of this individual who's going to be coming in the future, who will be the embodiment of this, that will be a faithful king and will restore the nation back to it. And in Isaiah 9, verse 6, it says, "For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness. From this time forth and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." And we get more as we read the Old Testament. We read the prophecies of this one who's coming, that is going to be this king. And then we get back to where we started in Mark chapter 14. That here we are again, we're in Bethany, that we're in the house of a leper, and this king, who up to this point in the Gospels has been establishing the fact that he is the one who is here. He is the Son of God. He is the one that was promised. Here he is being anointed in the house of a leper in Bethany by a woman. And when you think about it in the big picture of things, again, I go back to thinking about a movie. That wouldn't be how I would picture the anointing ceremony for a king, but yet it fits so perfectly with who our king truly is. And when we consider who Jesus is, what he has done for us, I don't think there would be a more poetic or better way for him to have been anointed, because he was here and he came for these exact people, the broken, the lost, the sick, the weak. That is who Jesus is the king for, and we as his people are those people as well. And this morning, as we consider what it means to us, for me, as I'm going to partake in the Lord's Supper as a memorial feast to this King Jesus, I can't help but be filled with thanks that he was willing, and that he wasn't proud, or that he wasn't mightier than he thought he was, but yet he was willing to endure these things for us, because ultimately that is what we needed. And as I said, one of the interesting things about Bethany, the duality of how you might take it when you start looking at the roots, one thing that I found was interesting is that in one sense, you can look at Bethany being the house of misery, suffering, the poor, the afflicted, the oppressed, but as well, depending on which direction you take it, it's the house of singing. And so for me, again, I think about this story here, that we're sitting here in Bethany, and how the people after Jesus was crucified, how they would have been terrified, they would have been lost, but yet eventually over time, how interesting would it have been for this place that was known for being the place of the suffering, the poor, and the afflicted to have become the house of singing. And so again, I hope that these thoughts maybe invoke something, but as we move forward in this worship service, let's consider these things. And even later this morning, as we continue learning this new song, the words of the chorus stick out to me. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of kings.